Hello everyone. Today's video we're going to be going over the basics of flying the T-6 over here in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Now the T-6 is a premium aircraft that you can get directly from the Microsoft Store. This is part of the Air Racers pack. I'm not going to be doing anything crazy as far as air racing goes. Instead I'm going to be concentrating on things like getting it started, taxiing, takeoff, navigation, landing, things like that. Let's go ahead and get started. So first things first, climbing inside this cabin, I've got to say there's a lot of stuff going on here, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And fortunately for us, the folks over at Microsoft decided, or maybe unfortunately, depends if you ask, have eliminated a lot of the complexity that could be on this aircraft. For example, all these lovely switches here for all firearms and things like that, none of that works. Half of the switches down here don't work. We have the radio, no we don't. We have an old-fashioned radio, we have a regular radio, we have all sorts of instrumentation. It looks all pretty nutty when you first take a peek, but it's really not that bad once you kind of get the hang of it. Now, one neat thing about this aircraft, of course, is that you have somebody who sits in the back seat. I always call it the voice from the trunk. Unfortunately for us, coming to this one, we can't. We can jump to the co-pilot seat. Go ahead and correct my head here. And you can see this is a whole different set of instruments back here, too. So it's totally possible to fly this aircraft from either one of these seats, especially if you want to make yourself insane by not being able to see where you're going, kind of a thing. But that being said, we're just going to jump up in the front seat there and kind of do it to it. All right, let's get started. So this thing is not a complicated aircraft to get started. Now, when I first sat down, I'm like, oh my gosh, what are all these needles and buttons and switches, and oh my gosh, what do I do? So the first thing you have to learn is where the fuel gauges are. I know that sounds kind of weird, but if you actually take your head and you kind of float down here and down on the floor, you'll notice there's this little thing down here on the floor that says I've got about 22 of something. And you'll also notice if I float down over here, you can see that I have 35 of something. This actually refers to the fuel that this aircraft is carrying at this time. We actually have a bunch of different tanks on here. We have a left tank, a right tank, and a reserve tank. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill everybody up with some fuel there so we have plenty of combustibles for the purposes of our flight. Now, of course, you're saying there, where's the reserve gauge? Well, that one's a little more involved, so I'm not going to worry about that today. So what do we need to do now? So what we're going to do is we're going to pop down here, and you can see this neat little switch that allows us to select what fuel tank we're starting on. According to the instructions, we're supposed to start this thing on the reserve tank. Not too bad. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure our flaps are in the up position. This one's kind of old school as far as the flap handle goes, but I still kind of like it. We have a little fuel pump. We'll get to that in just a minute. We have our landing gear. We're going to make sure it is in the up position. I should say down position. Not there. You want to make sure it's there. That can end badly. Coming up over here, we have a bunch of fun little switches that don't do anything, so don't worry about them too much. Pop it up here. You can take a look. We've got this nice little optimum flap position. Notice this is 20. It's a nice little reminder. And we have tons of switches here. Don't worry about them too much. The switch we do want, though, is this lovely little switch we like to call a primer. Now, of course, the way primers work is pretty good. If it's try again. If it is better than 20 degrees Celsius outside, you could probably give that sucker one pump. Let's say between 5 and 20, you could probably give it 2 or 3. Anything less than 5 degrees on the Celsius scale, you're probably going to have to pop this thing 4 times. Of course, this is flight sim, so it doesn't matter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and 1, 2, 3, and that should be way more than enough. It's about 15 Celsius if you're curious. So what I'm going to do now is, this is a strange little detail on this aircraft, but you're actually going to take the propeller control and you're going to pull it all the way back. Now, I found that kind of interesting. We're going to make sure our mixture is all the way forward. And now to build us up some fuel pressure, we're actually going to come down here, and this is a little manual fuel pump. You just got to kind of crank it a couple times to build up just enough fuel pressure to make sure everything's going to work okay. Taking a peek at our instruments, you can see we do have fuel pressure, and you can also see how it drops off really, really quickly. So when you do crank that sucker, make sure that you go ahead and reach for that key. Speaking of the key, we're going to slam the magneto into the both position. We're going to come down here. We're going to go ahead and flip on. We're going to turn it on. It's not even a switch. Why? So what we're going to do is we're going to pop on the battery switch located right here. As soon as we do that, I've noticed I've completely lost my fuel pressure. I'll give it one more whap of the pressurizer here. That should get me back up to pressure. And now we're just going to sit here and crank. Watch how simple this is. And that's it. That aircraft starts well. You want to catch it with the throttle. And as soon as you know that the aircraft seems to be rumbly, I'm going to go ahead and bring the pitch back to forward. As soon as that happens, we're just going to give it just a little bit of gas. And the manual says we're supposed to do nothing past 1,200 RPM at this time. So I'm going to give it just a teeny tiny bit, come up to about 1,000, which should be good. Now, of course, if I were a good pilot, I'd go ahead and lean the mixture a tiny bit to keep the spark plugs protected, but I'm not going to worry about it too much. I'm going to close up the starter case. This is looking good. I'm going to come over here. We've got ourselves a transponder. I'm going to go pop it to the altitude position, which means everything should be working pretty good. We have our little landing light switches here. Of course, we have our pitot heat if we need that. This thing that says passenger light is actually your beacon light, so make sure you do turn that sucker on. And of course, you have these two if you need to go ahead and adjust stuff like that. One thing you do want to watch out for is you have an oil cooler down here on the floor. The nice thing with the oil cooler is it's going to give you the ability to cool down your oil. I've flown this aircraft a little bit now, and I've never, ever, ever had issues with the oil getting more than like 110, 115. So I don't think that's an issue, but if it does, you can always grab that sucker and go ahead and slam that to the correct position. Last but not least, we have this little thing that says yoke visibility. Give this thing a wiggle if you want to make it go away. Click it. If you want to make it come back, go ahead and click it again. All right, this aircraft is now ready to rumble. Now, one thing I find super interesting is the fact that we immediately are up to 100 degrees centigrade, which is just like, okay, that sucker's moving pretty quick. The other thing I find very interesting in this aircraft is all your different navigational options. Now, of course, if you're floating over Saipan, Guam, where we are right now, you're going to be interested to know that we actually do have some reliable navigational instrumentation on this aircraft. Now, the bad news is, of course, is we don't have things like ADF. We can't come over here and push the button to the right operation. You can see it's all disabled. That's actually the radio, my apologies. But we do have VOR. So the way VOR works is a little different, a little more old-fashioned. We simply dial in the frequency that we need, and then we go ahead and see this needle swing around to it. So, for example, if I came down here and said, what do you want, 115.80, I think is what we have down at Guam, swap that sucker around. Once we get enough altitude, this needle will go and basically point in the general direction. We're not actually going to be going down to Guam today. We're sitting up here in Tinian, and we're going to fly up to basically, the top of the Marianas there. So it'll be pretty good. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're just going to give this thing a few more moments to get warmed up. Everything's looking, we're just about inside the green now. One thing it does say is we're supposed to be using 20 degrees of flaps. So we're going to click, click. As soon as you do that, of course, the flaps are going to start to just popping down. These are split flaps, which in my mind is just a little bit on the old-fashioned sense, but it is technically a curved flap, so it just does a pretty nice job. Now, taxiing this thing is a bit of a bear. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take the stick, and you're going to want to pull it towards you, just to kind of hang it there like that to keep pressure on the tail. I'm going to go ahead and release the parking brake. This thing needs about that much throttle to start rolling. Now, one thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to adjust your seating position to get your head up nice and high. Now, in the real world, of course, some people could open up the window so that they can see a little bit better. But for us, we're kind of stuck. Now, one thing you want to be careful for is whenever you're operating any tail draggers, you have to be very, very, very quick with the feet. If you feel it start to drift one way like it's doing right now, got to catch up with the feet immediately. Thankfully, the good folks over at Microsoft simplified things for us a little bit, so it's not too bad as far as takeoff goes. I'm going to go ahead and give that thing just a little bit of power, and we're just going to kind of roll our way over here to the runway. Not too bad at all. It's kind of a neat plane. I mean, the sounds in this thing, and of course, if you take this thing on VR, you'd be very impressed with just the structure of it. So when we use the brakes, we're going to gently hold the brakes, and if we feel the tail lifting rather, just go ahead and release the brake for a second. It's not worth doing a faceplant with this aircraft, trust me, I've done it plenty of times. All right, looks pretty good. We're going to go taxi onto the runway now, and the runway is just ahead of us, so it shouldn't be too bad for us as well. Again, like I said, have buttons on your joystick so you can fly around inside. Makes it easy. When you've tricked this plane around a corner, you want to be careful that the tail doesn't come flying out at you, but again, like I said, they simplified some of this flying for us to make it a little bit easier, so you shouldn't have nearly as much trouble, unless, of course, you got some kind of crosswind or something like that. Again, I'm holding my controls pretty much basically straight towards me so that we do have that nice positive tail ground contact. Cruising around, everything's looking pretty good. Take a look at my directional gyro. I'm not going to play with this at this time, but notice they actually do have a button that you can press. Compass, it's always a good time to double check that before takeoff. That'll be one of our last items on our little checklist here. Hop outside for a second. You can see we're making our way just kind of nice and gently right down the end there. Our destination, of course, is going to be a little bit to the north of us. It's going to be the northern end of the Marianas chain. I haven't visited Saipan in a while. It's an interesting island with an interesting history for sure. All right, line ourselves up. I can see that the sock is definitely favoring this particular runway, and it looks a little gusty. What else is new? Now, one of the fun questions they ask you is, at what speed does a windsock actually show wind? It's one of those things that's like, well, if there's any wind, right? It's actually a little more complicated than that. It's kind of a fun question. Now, the neat thing about windsocks, if you didn't know this, each one of those boxes represents a total of 5 knots of wind. So right now, we're looking at a little about 8 knots of wind kind of a thing. And of course, it's going to be coming that direction. All right, let's get ourselves over here. We're just going to line ourselves up and do a quick little run-up. We're going to make sure to stick ourselves into the wind before we do that, of course. A couple of notches of thrust, and we're just going to make sure this looks good. Fuel pressure is nothing right now, but that's perfectly fine. Carburetor heat, I'm not worried about that too much either. All right, I'm going to hold down the brakes. And we're just going to stick ourselves right into the wind. Okie dokie. All right, let's do our run-up. We're going to take this aircraft and we're going to push it forward. All the lights should go out once you hit 2,000 RPM. This is a World War II plane, which means you really get to exercise it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my pitch control, I'm going to pull it back, it should go, push it forward again, and we're going to pull it back out, and we're going to go, that's the sound it should make. Now we're going to go ahead and check our magnetos, click it off. Whew, that's quite a bit. Bring it back to normal. Click, click. All right, now a big drop. Not bad. We're going to go ahead and grab our engine anti-ice control. This is our carburetor heat. And we're just going to thunk. We should lose a little bit of RPM from that. And we're going to go ahead and slowly pull our throttle back. All right, looks good. Cancel the anti-ice. That's our carburetor heat, by the way. We're going to get a little warning light on the generator. We're good to go. Go ahead and taxi onto the runway. We're going to pop on our landing lights real quick. Landing lights are down here. Click. Now we're good to go. I'm going to go check to make sure the approach is clear. Approach looks pretty clear to me, so I'm not too worried about it. And I like to sit up a little bit higher. It just makes it easier to see for sure. All right, looks good, looks good. All right, let's go for it. Again, gentle. If the tail starts coming out at you, you have to be quick. All right, push that left foot forward. Good time to go ahead and double check your oil temperature. Right now my oil temperature is at 50, so I'm not concerned with it at all. Otherwise, I'd be reaching for the oil cooler. All right, let's get this thing airborne. So the trick here is you're going to use full power. It's not going to be too much of a rush here, but it is going to definitely start coming at you pretty fast. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to smoothly increase the throttle. We're going to make sure everything's in the green. Everything's in the green. Plane's going to start buffeting just a little bit. We're going to get up to about 25. We want everything to stabilize. Release the brakes. And now we're just going to smoothly push the throttle the rest of the way forward. As soon as this happens, of course, the aircraft is immediately going to start jerking to the left. Go ahead and take your yoke and pull it just slightly to the right. You don't need to do it much. The tail will loosen up, and about 60 miles per hour, you're going to find yourself suddenly quite airborne, and you're also going to find yourself mashing the right foot forward. Once we do get airborne, of course, we need to get rid of these pesky landing gears, so we're going to head and press the landing gear up button and send them out of the way. Once you get over 80 miles an hour, you can start popping up those flaps. Make sure you do it gently. We're just going to kind of milk it up a little bit. 100 miles an hour, we're going to pop up that next notch of flaps. And now we are on our way just like that. So again, this is a pretty easy aircraft to get yourself airborne. It is definitely far, far, far easier to fly than a lot of the tail draggers out there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and do my little turn here. This is kind of like a reverse crosswind. I'm going to hold myself at about 120 miles an hour here. Now the aircraft manual says basically you're supposed to use a less than maximum power, something like 80% power. So usually what I do is I go ahead and pull the right handle back, my throttle, all the way down about 35 inches of mercury. And then the manual also says you want to go ahead and drop this down to about 2,000 RPM, which you can see I've just done that right down there, and everything's looking pretty solid. Oop, did the RPM just a tiny bit too much. Perfect. Okay, let's go make our way over to our destination. Climbing this thing's pretty straightforward. Generally, I find that a comfortable climb is usually between 100 and 120 miles an hour. In a pinch, you could do as slow as 80 miles an hour, but I find that a little on the slow side. Again, it's going to be completely dependent on how much of a hurry you're trying to get out of the way from the ground there. And one thing I am very, very tickled by is the fact that it is in miles per hour versus being in knots. It's just kind of a sign of the times. All right, go ahead and double check to make sure everything's all nice and cleaned up on the aircraft. And now it's going to go ahead and get ourselves into a cruise. We'll let the nose sink just a tiny bit so we can kind of look out the window. Now we can go ahead and double check our fuel situation. So right now we don't want to be chilling on the reserve tank. Ideally the reserve tank is a reserve. So I'm going to switch over to the right side by clicking this one twice. And now we are on our right tank. Now generally, just like switching tanks on any sort of Piper or something like that, you want to go ahead and switch that fuel tank every half of an hour so that you don't run out of fuel. That's obviously got to be a problem. Of course, if you fly long enough, you will run out of fuel. And one thing I was really surprised by with this aircraft is just how fast it chews through fuel. This thing is just not very economical, especially if you're one of those people who are like, I'm just going to push the throttle all the way forward. It'll be fine. Let's go ahead and get this thing going. So now how do we navigate this aircraft? Well, the first method, like we saw a little bit earlier, was using the VOR. The downside to that, of course, is you need to have a VOR station that you can actually lock yourself into. I'm actually going to have to need even more up trim in order to get this thing stable. There we go. Close enough. Close enough. The other method, of course, we can use is old school pilotage. If you're going to be using old school pilotage, double check to make sure this instrument is reset every few minutes. You can press the D key on your keyboard if you want to quickly assign it. Of course, you can also come over here and grab the compass calibration and correct it yourself should it start to drift on you. Other than that, it's basically a traditional flight. Now, if you really want an experience, go ahead and pop into the co-pilot seat. And you notice the co-pilot here has an instrument-only flying hood, which means that all of your flying right now is under instrument conditions, which makes it kind of fun, not going to lie. Because you have your manifold pressure gauge down here, of course, and you have everything else. You also have this really old-school ADF radio, which I'm so disappointed that it doesn't work, because ADF is a perfectly valid form of navigation. I'm just disappointed. I kind of wish it. Obviously, this is supposed to be a racing plane, but I don't know. You know me. I'm kind of one of those people. All right, let's go ahead and put this thing down on the ground. So landing this aircraft is a relatively easy process as well. It's basically all about kind of undoing all the work that you just did. The general approach speed for this aircraft is going to be about 80. Once you're established, you can go ahead and slow down to probably about 70, even 65 if you're light enough. One thing you do want to do is when you are approaching with this aircraft to a landing, double check to make sure that you're on the fullest fuel tank, which for us at this time, by the way, be careful with this, don't accidentally shut it off, would be our left fuel tank. So I'm just going to enter myself into this handy-dandy downwind. Now, some of you, of course, is saying, well, what should we use for cruise settings? Well, for cruise settings, I usually use 30 inches of mercury as well as 2,000 RPM. Seems to get you going pretty smoothly. That's also very, very similar to your climb, rather. And that's going to be at 35 and 2,000 as well. So we're just going to sink down here. The altitude for the traffic is about 2,000 feet. It's a pretty lengthy runway. So that works out, like I said, pretty well. So I'm just going to sink down here, but basically treat this like any other general aviation airplane. Just remember that you're not approaching at 60 knots right now. You're approaching at, let's see, about 175 knots, which means if you're going to your favorite little local airport, you're going to scare the crap out of everybody because you're going to come ripping in so darn fast. All right, just going to look out my window. Again, this is our little left downwind for the main runway. Nothing too excessive, nothing too crazy just yet. We'll get to that on our final approach when we try to slow this thing down properly. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the nose up just a little bit. Again, you'd be amazed how sensitive this aircraft is. It's a really, really cool plane because of how it is. That looks pretty good. Looks pretty good. It's going to come out here. Imagine how pretty that bay looks at sunrise or sunset. It's got to be amazing. All right, there's our lovely old runway there. We're going to get right abeam the numbers. We're starting to swing in here. And we're going to start slowing down. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the throttle back. I'm going to get under 140 miles an hour. I'm going to go ahead and put down my first notch of flaps. I'm also going to put the gear down at the same time. The gear take a while in this aircraft to deploy. So one of the things I like to do is get them down kind of early. Look at my left wing. That looks pretty good. We're going to swing around to our base leg in just a moment. All right, I'm going to swing for a nice wide base here. Hold at about 120 is pretty good for my initial speed here. We don't want to get going too low or too slow, though. This aircraft does have a pretty nasty stall on it if you're not careful. All right, looks pretty good. Looks pretty good. We don't need to be tipping that much. We're just trying to fly the plane here. All right, looks pretty good. Looks pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and pop down my next notch of flaps. And you can see there's that beautiful, oh man, that cliffside is just amazing to see. You gotta imagine everybody jumping off into the water. All right, we're gonna pull ourselves into final. So our speed here is we're going for about 80 knots. I'm gonna go ahead and do my Gunfels checks here. Gas, undercarriage, mixture, propeller, flaps, light, speed. I know that the aircraft is configured for landing. Coming in here, we got a little bit of extra speed, but that's okay. One of the tricks here is just lift the nose up. Now you're gonna lift the nose up and you're gonna be like, I can't see the runway. Yeah, well, look what's happening to your speed. It would drift right off, even though the aircraft continues to sink. There we go. Now we got ourselves a good speed. All right, we're going to line up at the end of the runway here. I like to lift my head up just a little bit so I can see a little better. Now, there's two ways you can land this plane. You can do a 2-point landing, which requires you to come in a little fast, like I said, about 80 miles an hour, or you can do a 3-point landing, which is going to require you coming in at about 60, 65 miles an hour. Obviously, pick the type of landing that makes more sense to you. I'm a big fan of 2-pointers if I can get away with it. A lot of times I can't because you just end up getting a little on the slow side, and the plane's just like, just kidding, 3-point. All right, we're going to just bring ourselves down nice and gently down to the runway here. We're going to go for the 3-pointer. Nose is going to come up. We're going to start bleeding some speed. The plane's going to get very, very, very weird. You'll know what I mean. It starts to sink. Nose up. We're going to put all 3 points in the ground at the same time. And we are lovely. Nice. When you go to brake on this aircraft, brake very, very gently. Don't jam on it. There's a huge tendency here. And the other thing is when I'm braking, I'm pulling back on the stick to make sure the thing doesn't get away from me. All right. And we are on the ground once again. Pop up those flaps, and now we can make our way back to the runway. Or I should say back to the ramp. Hopefully this video helps. I really think this is a pretty neat plane. I've actually done quite a bit of kind of long cross-country sort of flights with it, just because it is really fast, and it really would surprise you. It really needs a GPS, which of course we can always borrow. Enjoy.